Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Shabbos Daf Tzadi Tes contains one Mishnah. From the beginning of the Daf until the Mishnah continues to describe the elements of the Mishkan and how the Leviim carried the Krushim, the panels that form the walls, on the wagons, and it gives us the size and the dimensions and the description of those wagons themselves. Then we get to the Mishnah, which introduces halachos of defining the shape of Rishus HaYochid and some halachos pertaining to that. The Gemara will then have a list of shailas, halachic questions, which remain, some of them unanswered, that are very specific in measuring the exact minute details in some of these halachos. First of all, the Gemara begins on the last few lines, the last few words of Daf Tzadi Ches, and it describes the panels that made up the Mishkan. Now each panel was 1.5 amma wide and 1 amma thick. It was 10 ammas tall, but the bottom amma wasn't the actual wall. It had 2 pegs that extended from the middle of the panel that formed sort of like legs, and there were sockets that those legs fit into. Now the way the Mishkan was held up was that a socket had 2 holes, one for each leg of adjoining panels. That way one socket held 1 leg from each panel, and each panel had 1 leg in each of 2 different sockets, and that held the whole thing up. So the Gemara describes the legs, the pegs that were at the bottom, and the Gemara says that, remember we said that the panel itself was 1.5 ammas by 1 amma. The peg itself was 1/2 amma by 1/4 amma, which means it had a space all around it of 1/4 amma. If you picture it in your head, you have the peg. Each one has a cleared away area of 1 full 1/4 amma. That way, you have 1/2 amma between the pegs, and you have a 1/4 amma all around the other 3 sides of each one. Now, the sockets themselves were made also 1.5 ammas by 1 amma, and it had a hole in it that fit the pegs precisely as 1/4 amma by 1/2 amma, and the walls of those holes, the walls surrounding those holes, the walls of the sockets measured 1/4 amma all around, except in the middle between the holes where you had 2 adjoining walls come together. So that was 1/2 amma, and that's why it fit perfectly. Next, the Gemara describes the roof was made of cloth, and it was 2 separate sheets of cloth that were hooked together with a series of hooks where they met. So those hooks were made out of gold, and they hooked into blue loops, and the cloth itself on the bottom layer was blue. So the Gemara describes it as the cloth with the gold hooks in it looked like stars in the sky. Okay, now the Gemara describes how they were made. The Gemara says that of the 2 of the layers of the roof, so the bottom one was made out of blue, purple, linen, and red wool. The upper one was made from hair of a goat, and the skill needed to make the upper one was greater than the skill needed to make the lower one. How do you know that? Because when it describes how it was made, it's about the lower one, it says, V'chol isha chachmas leiv biyadeh tavu. Every wise woman was able to spin it. As far as the upper one, the hair of the goat, it says, V'chol hanashim asher nasa libon oisana b'chacham. Every woman whose hearts raised them up with wisdom, with skill, they were able to make this. So it required more skill. Why? Because they spun the hair while it was still attached to the goat, and then they shore the threads from the backs of the goats. The reason why they did that was that it should be a shinier hair. Okay. The Gemara now quotes the Mishnah briefly and refers to the porches that are on the sides of Rishus HaRabim, and the Gemara continues by describing the wagons that the Bnei Merari Leviim used to carry the boards. So the Gemara has 2 statements here. 3 statements. First we have Rav, who says, this we've seen earlier, that the wagons, the space beneath them and on their sides, meaning the space beneath the wagons and the sides of the wagons and between the wheels of the wagons, were all Rishus HaRabim. Now Abaye describes it. Abaye says that the space between the wagons was equal to the length of the wagon. Let's describe this. The wagon itself was 5 amos by 2.5 amos. It had wheels which protruded, including the space from the wheel to the wagon, another 2.5 amos. That means that the wagon itself, counting the wheels and the length, was a full 5 amos square. Now the boards which were laid across it, the panels of the Mishkan, were 10 amos long. That means that if they were centered on the wagons, they protruded a total of 2.5 amos in each direction past the wagons themselves. Now there were 2 wagons traveling side by side. Each one had panels that stuck out at 2.5 amos. That means that the complete space between the wagons themselves was 5 amos, which is exactly the length of the wagon. Now the Gemara asks, why did the wagon have to be 5 amos long? We had said that the boards were 1.5 amos by 1 amma in their width and their thickness. So if they were lying on their 1.5 amos side, so what does 5 amos help? You could do 3 stacks in 4.5 amos. And if they were on their 1 amos side, so you certainly could fit 4 stacks in 4.5 amos. Why do you need more than 4.5 amos? Let it just be 4.5 amos long. Why do it have to be 5 amos long? So the Gemara says we didn't want to squash the boards together. We wanted to have a little bit of space, and that's why we had the extra amma. Okay. Now the Gemara has a statement of Rava. Rava says that the space between the body of the wagon until the end of the wheels was equal to the width of the body of the wagon itself, meaning it was 2.5 amos. Now, what was the width of the wagon? The Gemara says 2.5 amos. The Gemara asks, why did it have to be that wide? If you wanted to have the body of the wagon able to hold the boards themselves, b'shas atchak, if you had to squeeze them in there, so you could put them in on their side. They were only 1.5 amos. They were only 1 amma thick. If the wagon was 1.5 amos wide, to be able to hold them quite comfortably, why did it have to be 2.5 amos? So the Gemara says it had to be that wide because otherwise, when the panels, the boards were laid across them, the surface that they were balanced on would be too narrow and they would wobble. In order to keep them from wobbling, we had to have it wider, and therefore it was 2.5 amos wide. Okay. Now the Gemara says we know that the width of a Rishus Harabim street is 16 amos, and that's derived from the road, the minimum road length that these wagons needed to travel on. Now if you calculate it, the wagons themselves were only 15 amos wide. There were 2 wagons side by side. Each one, together with its wheels, was 5 amos wide, plus it was 5 amos space between them. That's 15 amos. So why do we say that the road had to be 16 amos? Now Rashi points out that the boards were traveling side by side. They were each 10 amos long, so you needed 20 amos. Rashi says the boards didn't count because they were above 10 tvachim, and Rishus Harabim only extends 10 tvachim high. Therefore, they were not in the calculation. Now, so anyway, the Gemara wants to know, why do you need more than 15 amos? So the Gemara says you have to have half an amma on each side. On the outside edges of the 2 wagons, each you have to have half an amma. That way, the Levi, if he saw that the boards started to slide into the gaps between them on the wagon, between the front stacks and the back stacks, then he would run around and he would wedge himself in there and hold them in place until they became steady and neat. But he needed space to walk around the outside of the beams, and therefore you had to have an extra half an amma on each side. Okay, this takes us to the Mishnah. The Mishnah goes into a totally different subject, and that is a discussion of the shape of Rishus Yachid. Again, if you remember in Hilchos Shabbos, carrying an object is an Issur D'Oraisa if it transfers from a Rishus Yachid to a Rishus Harabim, or vice versa. From either of those to a Karmelis or back is an Issur D'Rabbanan. Now, Rishus Yachid, the Issur only is triggered if you do a Kira, a transferring on Hanacha. 3 steps. That means that you take the object from being at rest, you transfer it to a different Rishus, and you put it back to being at rest. Now, the definition of Rishus Yachid is nothing to do with who owns it. In Hilchos Shabbos, it's defined by its shape. The shape has to be that it's surrounded by walls going either up or down of 10 tvachim high, and it itself has a flat surface of 4 by 4 tvachim. Now, the Gemara describes, the Mishnah, describes 2 examples of a Rishus Yachid, which is in a Rishus Harabim. And therefore, were you to put an object from Rishus Harabim onto these things, it would be transferring from Rishus Harabim to Rishus Yachid. What are the 2 things? The Mishnah brings 2 examples of this. One of them is if you have a well or a pit inside the Rishus Harabim, and the well has a bit of a wall around it, and the wall sticks up in Rishus Harabim, or you have a rock in Rishus Harabim. Now, either of these 2 things, if it's 10 tvachim high, and it has a surface on top which is 4 tvachim wide, in all sides, then it counts as Rishos Yachid. Therefore, you would have taken the object from Rishos Harabim and put it on this wall or this rock, or vice versa, then you would be violating an Isser Shabbos D'Oraisa. So the Gemara right away asks, why do you need two examples? They're both the same thing. It must be when you said the well, you didn't mean the wall around the well. You meant you put something in the well, because the well also has walls 10 tvachim high, and its bottom, its floor, the floor of the well, or floor of the hole, could also be 4 tvachim wide. So you brought two examples. One is something which sticks up out of Rishos Harabim, and one is something which is a hole that goes down into the Rishos Harabim and forms a Rishos Hayachad. Then why did you talk to me about the wall around the well? What does that have to do with anything? So the Gemara says this must be proof to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan says that the height of the hole, the pit or the well, can combine with the wall around it to add up to 10 tvachim. For example, if the hole is 5 tvachim deep and the wall that rises from the surface is 5 tvachim high. So altogether you have a wall 10 tvachim high and the floor of the pit itself is 4 tvachim wide. That counts as a Rishos HaYachid. Now the Gemara brings a brisa which supports this. The brisa says if you want to drink water from a well, if you want to draw from the well, so unless the well's walls plus the wall around it combine to 10 tvachim, you can't draw unless you have a fence around the entire thing so that it's a Rishos HaYachid. And you can't even stick your head into it and drink unless you stick your head and the majority of your body deep into it so that you're sure that you're not moving from a Rishos HaYachid to a Rishos Harabim. The Gemara has a series of very precise and minute shilas. The Gemara presents the following thing. Rav Mordechai asked a question, and he asked it to Rav, Rav Yosef, and to Abai. They all gave the same answer. He wasn't pleased with the answer. His answer was, let's say somebody throws an object from Rishos Harabim onto the top of a pillar, which is 10 tvachim tall and 4 amos wide. So that pillar is a Rishos HaYachid, standing in the middle of Rishos Harabim. When he threw the object, he transferred it from Rishos Harabim to Rishos HaYachid. But Rav Mordechai asks is that it passed through a Malkum Patur. A Malkum Patur is an area which is more than a 10 tvachim high, and it's not in a Rishos HaYachid. It's not in any specific area. So if it passed through a Malkum Patur, so he says maybe you wouldn't be violating the Nesed Daraisa here because it had to pass above 10 tvachim, and that's a Malkum Patur. Since it had to go from Rishos Harabim to a Malkum Patur and then to Rishos HaYachid, maybe that's not an Isser Daraisa. Maybe only if it goes directly from Rishos Harabim to Rishos HaYachid is it an Isser Daraisa. Now, why did it pass through a Malkum Patur? So the halacha is that Rishos Harabim is only 10 tvachim high. This thing must have gone above 10 tvachim in Rishos Harabim to be able to get onto the top of the post, which is 10 tvachim high. Otherwise, how would it be able to get there? It has to go up and then come down to land on it. Now, Rashi understands that the issue is that it was over 10 tvachim in Rishos Harabim. Other Rishonim understand that even in a Rishos HaYachid, which goes all the way up to the sky, but if it's a post, it doesn't go up to the sky. And they have their own reason for understanding it that way. Now, the Gemara says that all these Amoraim answered, and one after another, they said that it's explicit in our Mishnah. The Mishnah says that if you put something onto the wall of the well, or the pit, or the rock in Rishos Harabim, it's an Isser Daraisa. So you clearly see that that's the case that you're referring to. It had to go up before it comes down. So what are you asking? So he said to them, after he heard what they said, he was upset. He said, you're all spitting the same spit. He didn't appreciate the proof from the Mishnah. So they said, why not? So he said, maybe the Mishnah is talking about where it was a needle. You put a needle on the rock. So it's so small. So how much did it rise rate? It could have just risen a needle's thickness above Rishos Harabim into the Makayim Patur. So they step back to him and says, okay, who cares how much it is? If it went into the Makam Patur, so that's your question. And you clearly see that the answer is that it's an Isser Daraisa if we do that. So they said, no. What he was saying was one of two things. First of all, maybe there is a notch or something which sticks out of the rock. The halach is that there's the Choyrei Rishos HaYachid, something which sticks out or sticks into a Rishos HaYachid counts as a Rishos HaYachid itself. Therefore, a ledge or a notch which sticks out of that rock would count as a Rishos HaYachid, even though it's not 10 tvachim high, that particular ledge, and maybe the needle landed on that. Or maybe there was a crack in the rock or something, and the needle kind of snaked its way up to the top through that, but it was never 10 tvachim above Rishos Harabim. Okay. The Gemara now has another shaila. So first of all, Rav Misha said that Rav Yochanan asked the following thing. What if you have a carmel surrounded by a fence, and that makes the entire area into Rishos HaYachid? Now the fence itself is not 4 tefachim wide. It is 10 tefachim high, but it's not 4 tefachim wide. But it fences in the area, and therefore the area inside the fence becomes a Rishos Yachid. Now somebody throws something from Rishos Harabim, and it lands on top of the fence. So what's the question? The fence itself is not wide enough to be a Rishos Yachid, but it makes the area right next to it, inside the fence, into a Rishos Yachid. So do we say that the fence now counts as part of the Rishos Yachid through the halacha called Maliyah? That the entire Rishos Yachid is always viewed as if it's filled up. It's full, all the way to the top, the entire space of it. Therefore, the wall, the fence itself, can adjoin the filled up, the lumdishly filled up area of the Rishos Yachid itself. So the Gemara says that both Ula and Rav Chia Barashi said in the name of Rav, and Rav Yitzchak in the name of Rav Yochanan, it is not an issue. Think about it. The fence itself makes the area inside it into Rishos Yachid. The fence itself should certainly count as a Rishos Yachid. Okay, Rav Yochanan's next question was, what if you have a pit, hole in the ground, and it's nearly 10 tefachim deep. It's 4 tefachim wide, it's nearly 10 tefachim deep. What does the guy do? He takes a shovelful from the bottom of the pit, and he puts it outside the pit into Rishos Harabim. And that shovelful makes it 10 tefachim deep. So in one action, he both completed it to be a size to be a Rishos Yachid, and he removed something and put it into Rishos Harabim. Can you have the creation of the Rishos Yachid and the malacha, the isser of transferring from inside that pit to outside into the Rishos Harabim? Can those two things happen at the same time, and could he be chayav for that? The akira, can the akira create the Rishos Yachid in the same instant? Is that considered like he did an akira from a Rishos Yachid, or not? Now, if you resolve that, and I have another question, and that's what if he did the opposite? What if he took dirt from outside the pit, which was 10 tefachim deep, and he put the dirt inside the bottom of the pit, and now it's not 10 tefachim deep anymore. So he's putting the dirt down, his hanacha is bringing it to rest, also destroyed the Rishos Yachid. It's not Rishos Yachid anymore. In the same motion that he transferred, that he brought the dirt to rest and completed his malacha, it became not a Rishos Yachid anymore. Do we say that doesn't count, or that is also a malacha? Okay, now the Gemara wants to solve this one. The Gemara says we have a statement of Rav Yochanan elsewhere which should solve it. Now we said that if you throw something for exactly 4 amos in a Rishos Harabim and it hits a wall, so if it lands 4 tefachim, if it lands above 10 tefachim, then it's suspended in a Rishos Harabim in a Makam Petur, so it's not an Isser Deraisa. If it lands under 10 tefachim, it's like it's on the floor, and it's within Rishos Harabim, and therefore that is a Isser Daraisa. And Rav Yochanan asked, what do you mean, but how did it travel 4 amos? If it hits the wall, it bounces back. Rav Yochanan answered, it sticks to the wall. Now the question is, what do you mean it sticks to the wall? Then it's not 4 amos. It traveled, the space isn't 4 amos anymore, because now the thickness of the thing, which Rav Yochanan says is a cake of pressed figs, so the thickness of the figs sticks on the wall, and it's no longer a distance of 4 amos from where you stood to the wall, which is now closer because of the figs that are stuck on it. So if that's true, that means that the 4 amos that he threw it disappears at the same moment that the object comes to rest. It should be the same thing here, where he transferred the dirt from outside the pit to inside the pit, but the Rishos Yachid disappeared as he put the dirt down. Gemara says that's not a proof. The dirt here is going to stay in the bottom of the pit, and therefore the pit is now smaller. The figs are not going to stay stuck on the wall, and therefore the space stays the same size, just with the figs that are stuck on it. It does not grow the wall, widen the wall, and make the space between you and the wall smaller. Okay, now Rava has a question which seems very similar to Rav Yochanan's. He says, what if you have 4 sticks stuck in the ground, and you throw a plank of wood, it lands on top of the sticks, and now it forms a Rishos Yachid. It's 4 tefachim wide, and it's 10 tefachim high. So at that moment, you exactly created the Rishos Yachid just as it landed. So the Gemara says this is the same as Rav Yochanan's question. The Gemara says no, he's referring to where you threw the board, you threw the plank of wood with another object on its back. So the plank of wood landed, and the other object landed either exactly at the same moment or a split second later. Do we say that it must be a split second later, and therefore the Rishos Yachid was created before it landed, and therefore it's not involved in the shiloh? Or do we say no, it landed together, and therefore the Rishos Yachid and this object on the back of the plank of wood all landed at the same time? And the Gemara leaves this question unresolved. Okay, now the Gemara moves on to a slightly different subject. The Gemara says that a nut floating in the water is not called at rest. If you lift up a nut from floating in the water, that's not an akira. You haven't taken something at rest and put it in motion. It was always in motion. It was floating in the water. However, if you take some water out of the water, so that is called an akira, even though the water is also floating around on top of the other water, but we view the entire body of water as one object, and he took some water off the top of the ground. Now, the question is, that part's obvious. The question is as follows, and this is what Rava asks. Let's say you have a nut sitting in a bowl, which is floating on top of the water. So do you say that the nut is at rest in the bowl, and the bowl is floating around, and therefore if you pick up the nut, that's an akira, you moved an object which was at rest in the nut and made it in motion? Or do you say, no, since the whole bowl is floating around, so the nut that's in it and the bowl together are one unit, and they are all in motion, and therefore if you lift it up, it's not going to be considered to be an akira, the object was already in motion before. The Gemara also says, Teku, we do not have an answer to this at this time. Now, that takes the end of the Daf Sadi test, and we'll pick up with a similar question.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.